Hello and welcome back to another tier list video. Today I will be ranking the age 3 leaders and wonders, which I'm very excited to do. And with being now already in age 3, this will of course now be already the last part of this little tier list series that we had over the last weeks. And after that I will go back to maybe the more normal content on this channel with doing some game analysis again, especially also with the World Championship games that will soon finish. Alright, now we are on age 3, and of course even more maybe so than in the two ages before. It of course depends completely on your setup, how strong a specific leader and a specific wonder is in this age. I think all of the wonders, all of the leaders can be extremely strong if you have the right setup, and it also of course then depends quite a bit on your play style. Which situations do you have, how often, on how useful is a specific leader and a specific wonder for you. So it's a bit difficult to create an objective tier list, and that probably doesn't exist anyway. So this will be heavily influenced on how I try to set up my civilizations and how I am maybe on my play style that I have. And if you have a different play style and end up more often in different situations, then of course the list can look completely different to you. So yeah, but nonetheless, it's fun creating such a list, and so without further ado, we are going to start with it. And of course, as the tier list before, that again will be a three-player tier list with sometimes me mentioning how specific leaders and wonders maybe would be ranked in other player counts. The first leader that we are having is Albert Einstein. And I do think Albert Einstein is a very useful and also a very versatile leader who can be used for completely different purposes. Of course, you are getting some additional science production out of him, and the beginning of age 3 maybe 2, but as soon as you get a copy of computers or multimedia, he will maybe give 3 additional science production. So if Albert Einstein is early in the row, you can consider taking him, first of all, mainly maybe for his economical bonus of the additional science production. That can be very useful to have during age 3, and then of course along the way he will provide you some additional culture with developing the technology. So I do think Einstein can be a very nice age 3 leader to get also quite early. Maybe you have just scientific methods running and the age 2 leader that you're having is not doing that much at the moment. Just switch to Einstein and you will have a very solid leader that you can maybe build on. Just maybe as soon as you get multimedia as computers, you will have lots of science production, can develop some technologies and score a lot of points. But also getting him late in age 3 can be perfectly fine. Maybe you had a strong age 2 leader for a while and you have a bit of science saved up, some technologies in hand, and then maybe for the last turn you can just go for Einstein, develop maybe 3 technologies and score 9 culture in a single turn. So that can also be a very nice use of him. Also, of course, you can go for him and then because you just need to develop technologies, which you most of the times, especially if you have some science production, want to do anyway. He is very versatile on which game plan you are having. Maybe you just want to build a lot of culture and then you get some culture and science on top with Einstein. But maybe you have Einstein, scientific methods, or maybe got early computers, but you're actually trying to set up a big military game. But also for that, he's very useful. The science might help you to maybe get all of the necessary technologies going quicker. And also, if you go for military, you of course have to develop some technologies and will score some additional culture with them. So I do think he's very versatile. If you have computers or multimedia, he's giving you 3 additional science per turn. He definitely can manage to give you 3 culture per turn, potentially even more. If you are very nicely set up, you can maybe go up to 4, 5, or potentially even more culture per turn, and that is very strong. He's very useful, very versatile, and with that I will put him in A tier. However, he will be read on the lower end of A tier. There will be some other leaders that I will rank a little bit higher. And I did also consider just putting him in the top end of B tier, but at the end I thought he is just very useful, versatile, can be quite strong, and with that deserves to be in A tier. The next we have a leader who can be very, very strong, who can just boost your economy completely, have very big effects on your economy if you get him, and then just lets you build a lot of stuff, prepare very well for impacts. And yeah, so of course Bill Gates is very, very strong, but I also Yeah, found it a bit strange that I myself, for some reason, don't end up having him that often. Because if you remember my videos that I did after the last two World Championships, where I counted which leader and wonder I had how often in my World Championship games, some other strong leaders that I will rank highly later on, for example Molina and Pierre, I had during my last two World Championships, each of them I had 18 times. Bill Gates, in the last two World Championships combined, I had two times. So that is a little bit weird, and maybe you actually don't end up having him that often, but I do think you will have maybe some scientific methods labs more often than not. Maybe sometimes the chance to get early computers. Sometimes you can even take him maybe with being on three alchemies with the hopes of getting computers later on. So I actually do think it's not that difficult to set up for him. I do think, especially if you get him early, he is just very, very strong. But also if you get him late, he can still be very fine. Maybe getting the resource production just for one turn can still help you setting up some nice stuff. And then he gives the one-time culture bonus at the end. So for the few turns that you had him, maybe you can still get a reasonable amount of culture out of him. So he is, of course, completely strong, and for him, maybe it is also just a case that he gets relatively often denied. If you are well set up for him, it definitely can happen that one of the other players thinks, if now this player gets Bill Gates, I just don't have any chance to win any longer, or not any great chances, so I will just take him for myself, even though I'm not perfectly set up for him, maybe only have alchemies, and maybe that is also one of the reasons why I didn't have him that often. Despite he only appearing two times in all of my World Championship games from the last two World Championships, I will still put him in A tier. But I at the end didn't put him in S tier, even though of course he can be extremely strong. The additional resource production, if you have him, you will have ideally a lot of labs, scientific methods or computers, meaning you will have a lot of science production, you will have a lot of resource production, and with that you can just easily prepare for a lot of impacts, build a lot of stuff, maybe use his additional resources to set up for war. So he is just extremely strong. But maybe because I didn't have him that often, I at the end didn't put him in S tier, even though it definitely could be considered, just because he can be that strong, to just put him in S tier. But at the end, I reserved that spot for one or more different leaders. Then the next leader that we are having is Chaplain. Chaplain gives you two happy faces and produces you some additional culture depending on the level of the best theater that you are having. And I do think Chaplain is definitely very solid. How strong he is maybe depends on how much you actually need the happy faces from him. Because if the happy faces are not relevant at all, then he just produces you maybe 3, maybe 4 culture per turn, and it of course can be fine. Maybe you have a strong economy, and then you very easily can set up one movie with Chaplain, and out of the sudden your culture production gets a big boost. But if you don't need the happy faces at all, just getting a bit of culture production is, I think, a little bit mediocre compared to what other leaders can maybe offer you. Einstein maybe can give you that amount of culture plus some science production on top. However, if you need the two happy faces, then of course he can be quite strong. Sometimes there are even situations where you mainly go for him for the happy faces. For example, you want to build a lot of military, but you didn't find a nice happy face solution. Then Chaplain is in the row, and out of the sudden the two happy faces will allow you to put 2 additional workers into the military, which can have a huge difference. So the happy faces have the potential to be quite strong. Ideally, of course, you get both. The happy faces are useful, and you can maybe go for a theater. Thanks to the additional happy faces, it can also be sometimes perfectly fine to not have invested into a happy face solution like upgraded temples or arenas at all, and just the happy faces from operas or movies plus Chaplain will be enough, especially if you have maybe 1 or 2 more happy faces from other sources. So he can also maybe lead to you not having to invest into any happy face solution, which can be fine. So there are definitely situations where Chaplain is just fine, and I also went for him 6 times just in the last World Championship, and so a lot more often than Bill Gates. In the last World Championship, I actually had Bill Gates 0 times. But nonetheless, I do think there are maybe leaders who are a bit stronger, but Chaplain definitely is very fine, very often, sometimes very strong if you need the happy faces, and then also get a culture reduction on top. Also, of course, he synergizes very well with the Hollywood. You're able to make that wonder quite a bit bigger. Later on, when we will speak about Pierre, we will speak about how strong his Olympic Games are. Just getting a 1 of 8 culture is very nice, but Chaplain and maybe also some of the other theater leaders can give you a very similar effect with the Hollywood. If you have Chaplain go for the Hollywood, basically one time his culture production will be doubled. If you have movies, then he is in the turn when you will build the Hollywood, give you 4 culture for the movies and 8 culture for the Hollywood. So it's basically having maybe his own Olympic Games to some extent. So now that is a nice synergy. Also with the internet, he gives a little bit of additional points, but not as much as for the Hollywood. So at the end, I will put him in C tier, but did also consider moving him up to B tier. I do think for 2-player games, where having a lot of culture production is more important and setting up for a big Hollywood can be very, very strong. He might move up to B, maybe even to A tier. Then we have a leader next with Gandhi, who I think is very difficult to rate between all of those other leaders that we are having. For the other leaders, we can maybe sometimes compare how much culture do they are producing on average, how much setup do you need, what else are they offering. Gandhi is producing also some culture to culture production, which is compared to the other leaders not that much, but of course his effect can be completely game warping, can maybe turn a losing game into out of the sudden a winning game, because you would just get crushed by military, but then Gandhi makes you safe from wars. The others don't have enough military actions to declare any wars against you, and you can just ride your culturally that you are having to a victory in the game instead of getting defeated with getting multiple wars declared on you. So he can completely change the outcome of a game, and his presence in the Leaders and Wonders mix definitely maybe sometimes changes on how strong a military push has to be evaluated. If there's always the fear of one of the opponents getting Gandhi, maybe it's better to try something peaceful yourself. Or you maybe have to really see that you get more than 6 military actions, or at least 6 military actions going. But even if one of the opponents has more than 6 military actions, it's still more costly and more difficult to war against Gandhi. So in those situations, he's of course not as strong as if the door for wars is just completely shut down, but it still can be a very useful effect. At the end, I made a decision to put him in B tier. Sometimes he will be extremely strong, and but a lot of other times when you're maybe not that much in danger from the military, he is just not doing that much. The 2 culture production alone is of course not as great. Sometimes of course you can go for him when you are still somewhat safe, but maybe he allows you then to be a bit more greedy and investing your resources, and maybe allows you to go for some additional culture production like this. So that is also a way to use him. I did consider him also putting him in C tier, because I do think if you are in the need to go for Gandhi, maybe you're in a bit of a difficult spot anyway, but of course then he is a leader who can save you out of this difficult spot. But I didn't go for Gandhi that often in my last 2 World Championships, maybe because I more often just managed to make sure that I can defend myself with having a good economy ongoing. But now at the end I thought B tier is maybe a fine place for him. Sometimes he is completely game changing, and other times, and maybe more often, he is just producing a bit of culture. And so I put him in B tier, but rather with considering moving him down to C tier instead of moving him up to A tier. Then the next leader that we are having is Fleming. A leader who can potentially produce you a lot of cultures. If you have multimedias and movies, he produces you 6 additional culture, which is definitely quite a big amount. But of course, especially in 3 and 4-player games, it's not that easy to set up something like this. In 2-player games, I do think it's more easily possible, and I do think for 2-player games he goes at least into A tier. Probably not into S tier, but I do think into A tier. For 3 and 4-player game, it's more difficult to set up for him. But I do think it's still possible to maybe at the beginning of age 3 or the middle of age 3 go for one of movies, operas, or journalism's multimedias, and then maybe you have the other copy in hand, start producing maybe a rather slow amount of culture with 2 or 3 with Fleming, and then in the late parts of age 3 maybe you have the economy to support it, or maybe just at a point when there is no danger of wars any longer, you can go for the other of the 2, and then he produces you some very nice culture for the remaining games, gives a very nice boost, an even bigger one than Chaplain for wonders like internet and Hollywood. So going for a big Hollywood with Fleming can just be a very nice way to score a lot of points. You maybe just need 1 opera, 1 multimedia, which is possible to set up if you have a decent economy, and then you finish the Hollywood, and just with the opera and the multimedia He gives you already, I think, 20 culture for the Hollywood. If you have a movies and multimedias, it already goes up even higher. Then he gives you 24 culture just with having, oh, actually more. I did miscalculate. Opera and multimedia would, of course, already be 22. And then 26, I think, with just one movie and one multimedia. And of course, sometimes you have the potential to make it even bigger. So that's a very strong combination if you manage to pull it off. And then, of course, additionally to the culture production, there is an effect that is somewhat difficult to measure on how much worth is it actually, but I do think it sometimes is maybe a little bit underestimated, because if you, I had some games where I got flaming relatively early, maybe I had just had a little bit of additional culture production, but especially in 3-player games, you just switch between the two opponents because you can't look at the same hand 2 times in a row, but you can just switch every time between both of those opponents, and he gave me a lot of knowledge about impacts, a lot of knowledge about what tactics my opponents have, or how, if they have wars or not. That this information can be quite useful and can potentially result in a lot of culture if you just a lot better can prepare for impacts at the end, if you know exactly how much afraid you have to be from wars, how much strength potential the opponents might have. And so I do think that ability definitely shouldn't be underestimated. I do think sometimes it can be worthwhile to switch to flaming. For example, you have Bach, and Bach would actually produce you maybe 1 or 2. For 2 it's very questionable, but maybe Bach produces you still 1 additional culture. I do think you should definitely still consider electing flaming already to get the knowledge earlier. Of course, it's part, sometimes the knowledge won't result in more than 1 culture, but I do think there's a good chance that it will. So the knowledge definitely shouldn't be underestimated, and with that being quite a useful ability on top, also maybe allows you to pull an aggression off, having knowledge about defense cards can just be quite nice, and with that I will put him in B tier. He has quite a bit of potential, but is also not really that easy to pull off in a 3 and 4 player game, maybe in a 3-player game more than in a 4-player game, but he has a lot of potential, and even if you have only one of the 2 buildings, combined with the information that he is giving you, he can be a very fine leader. Then next we have Marie Curie. And no, sometimes I'm hearing from players that Marie Curie is the H3 leader that they like the least, and that she is not really that great, but I do think Marie Curie is actually perfectly fine. I do think ideally you want to get her rather early in H3, and she can already be quite fine if you maybe just have coal, and then alchemies or scientific method. Then you get very early in H3 a leader that produces you 2 additional culture, 2 additional science, and a tiny bit of strength. That can just be a very nice package. For example, consider you are having Nobel. Nobel is giving you 2 science and 2 strength, and then Marie Curie, if you have coal, gives you that plus 2 additional culture production maybe. And if you have coal scientific method set up, I do think if Marie Curie is available early and the H2 leader that you're having is not doing a lot of work at the moment, Marie Curie can just be a very, very fine pickup, and so I do think that is quite fine. Then of course, if you are H3 is a little bit progressing, maybe you had a chance to get an early oil, but more often maybe you have the chance to go into computers, then she's already giving you 3 culture production, which is not as much as some of the other leaders are giving, but she is then still giving some additional science on top, a little bit of strength on top, and I do think that is a very useful package. And I actually don't rarely end up having her as my leader, and with that I will put her at the lower end of B tier, because no, I just think quite often she is just a very nice package to get, especially early in H3 when you maybe don't have the setup for something like Flaming and Chaplain yet, and just getting Marie Curie, enhancing your economy, and also being able to maybe make her effect stronger throughout H3 can be very, very fine. And so I will put her in B tier. And also, if you have the chance to maybe get an early oil combined with Marie Curie, I do think that can be quite strong, because one of the downsides of an early oil can be that maybe investing 9 science sometimes can be a bit too much. But then if you have Marie Curie, you're getting 3 additional science production. Having 1 oil with Marie basically it gives you 3 culture and 3 science, basically like having a multimedia, which is quite strong, and then with the additional science production and also the culture that you're already getting, I do think it can be very pleasant to maybe go for an early oil play if you have enough civil actions to support it and maybe at least already some decent science production. And then she's maybe similar a little bit to Bill Gates, because if you have Bill Gates, you are investing into computers or maybe scientific method, and then you end up having a lot of science production and a lot of resource production. With Marie Curie, you invest into oil, and then you're having also maybe a lot of resource production, a lot of science production. Of course, maybe not as much science as with going for Bill Gates with maybe scientific method or computers, but and you are getting some culture production directly, and a little bit of strength maybe, so that can be of course quite a strong combination, but you don't have the chance to go for Marie Curie plus oil that often, especially very early. But I do think she's also very fine if you have maybe coal mines and scientific method or maybe alchemy in some situations, then she also can be already quite fine. Maybe it could also be considered to move her down to C tier, but I end up having her relatively often, and I think she just is quite pleasant to play, and will put her at the lower end of B tier. Next up, we have a leader who is quite powerful. Molina Ditri has quite a lot of different effects who all can be extremely useful. You get 1 additional happy face per best theater that you're having, which sometimes can result in something like 3 additional happy faces. Then Molina Ditri can just serve as your complete happy face solution if you didn't commit into one already, which of course often you maybe already did with going for organized religion or team sports, but maybe especially if you have a bunch of dramas, maybe those happy faces are enough for going into H3, and then if you get Marlene Dietrich on top, you don't just need any more happy face solution for the rest of the game. Then she produces some culture, and then of course she has the ability to double one of your units for the purpose of tactics, and that of course can have also quite a powerful effect, sometimes allowing you to just go for a lot more strength than you usually would have. Sometimes it will just allow you that you maybe need to invest less into the military to be competitive and have more resources lying around to build some other peaceful culture-oriented stuff. So a very nice package of abilities. And yeah, and with that I will put Marlene Dietrich in A tier before Bill Gates, not in S tier, because sometimes she can also be, yeah, I mean, if you have theaters, of course, she will be quite strong, and most of the times you take her when you have theaters. Sometimes you take her when you have maybe only theaters in hand, and also maybe just her, take only her in hand. Sometimes you want to go for a military push, and the ability of her actually makes that much of a difference that she is completely worthwhile just to go for the additional strength that you are getting, so that is definitely also happening. A leader to compare that you easily can compare Marlene Dietrich to is of course Chaplain, because Chaplain also gives additional happy faces and some culture from theaters. So yeah, the question is how much better is Marlene Dietrich than Chaplain, and there are definitely situations where Chaplain is just a better leader than Marlene Dietrich. Of course, he doesn't have the ability of doubling the amount of units for tactics, and that is of course a very, very useful part of Marlene Dietrich. But if you are not needing this ability, then I think there are definitely situations where Chaplain can be better. For example, if you have Chaplain with operas, and that's not even the ideal setup for Chaplain, he's already producing you 3 culture. If you have Marlene Dietrich with opera, you would need 3 operas to produce the same amount of culture, and then of course you would have 1 happy face more, but it's a lot easier to invest into maybe 1 opera or 1 movie. So I do think you will find yourself in situations where you just want to get a bit of culture production going now to not fall too much behind, and start converting your economy into culture, but you have to still be very careful about the military, and then you can maybe just invest into 1 movie or 1 opera, and then Chaplain can just be the better leader because he doesn't really require you to have multiple operas or multiple movies to get a really strong effect out of him. And so definitely don't always take Marlene Dietrich over Chaplain, but Marlene Dietrich, of course, with the military ability will just often be a lot stronger, and with that I will put her in A tier. And a nice little thing that you can do with her is that you can also use her military bonus for colonization. For example, if you have the fortifications or hussar tactics, you can just send one cannon or one cavalryman or one tank with her, and then you already get a tactic bonus for colonization. So in those situations, she can be quite a strong colonization leader also. One downside of her is, of course, that your bonus only applies to your best theaters. You will sometimes find yourself in situations where you maybe have Molina Ditri with dramas, which is a very nice combination because it's easier to get a lot of dramas than maybe a lot of movies. So that is often a very nice setup to have with Marlene. But then maybe sometimes you end up in a situation where you want to upgrade to movies, and then if you don't manage to upgrade all of your theaters, then it's actually not really that great. So Marlene Dietrich can sometimes limit your options in that regard, but she also synergizes nicely with the Hollywood, which can potentially be a very high scoring wonder, and is just a very versatile package of abilities, and I do think I will put her in A tier. And as I said already earlier, I had her a total of 18 times in the last 2 World Championships compared to only 2 times having Bill Gates. So I just think you very often find just a very nice use case for her, and it definitely could be considered to even move her up to S tier, as her military ability sometimes can be extremely strong, and she, even without that, could be at least a fine leader. Without the military ability, I think she would maybe go down to C tier, so probably even behind Chaplain. But with the military ability on top of those nice things, I think she is just very strong. The next leader that we are having is Mandela. And I do think Mandela is underestimated, at least maybe by some players, or at least I sometimes heard players saying that Mandela is not that great, and it's difficult to get a lot of additional happy faces, and it's something that you don't want to do sometimes anyways, building more happy faces than you need to. And it is definitely true, but the thing about Mandela is he is already perfectly fine, maybe even strong, if you don't have any excess happy faces and can just take him, of course, without the additional cost of the 3 additional civil action that you have to pay. So in a situation where you have an unhappy worker, or where you can maybe manage to get an unhappy worker during your turn with maybe increasing your population 1 or 2 times, and especially if it's early in age 3, I do think Mandela can be a very nice pickup, because he, even without having excess happy faces, will already give you 2 culture reduction and 1 civil action, and a civil action should definitely not be underestimated. I do think that if you have pyramids and get hit by Ravages of Time, more often than not, I'm not really happy about Ravages being revealed, unless, of course, maybe my opponents are losing even more to the Ravages, with maybe losing Hanging Gardens or even an H1 Wonder. But I oftentimes think that in H3 you need a lot of civil actions, and unless you're really having a lot of them, losing one for the pyramids is not compensated enough from the 2 culture reduction. So let's just say maybe sometimes it will be fine to lose the pyramids, maybe sometimes not. So 1 civil action I do think is at least worth 2 culture. Sometimes it depends, of course, a lot on the situation, but I do think it's definitely fine to value it sometimes somewhat like 2 culture, maybe even more. In some situations, definitely a lot more. And with that, Mandela, even without having excess happy faces, is maybe a leader who gives you something worth like 4 culture, potentially more. And and the only setup that you need is that you have to have an unhappy worker when you take him, which is already quite strong. And then you have the ability to, in case it is just useful for you, build maybe more happy faces than you need, and then you get a lot of culture production out of him. Sometimes you had a nice colony game, you have a lot of yellow tokens, and then he has the potential to maybe give, if you have 4 or 5 excess happy faces, he gives you in total 7 culture production plus a civil action, which is a very, very big amount of value. And so I do think Mandela is definitely one of the stronger leaders, and I also end up having him relatively often, even though recently I think I didn't have him that often, but overall I do think he's just very strong, and the civil action is quite useful, allows you to do more stuff. You even are getting the civil action immediately in the turn when you are electing him, so immediately you get the additional civil action, makes it very easy to take him and elect him in case you don't have to pay the additional civil action cost, of course. that will be a reason to sometimes not go for him, but I always, if I don't have to pay the 3 additional civil action, Mandela is a leader that I'm highly considering, especially if he's available early and the civil action still has the chance to just give me a lot of value during H3. So with that, I will put Mandela in A tier, and I will put him between Bill Gates and Einstein. Could also be fine to maybe put him behind Einstein, but at the end I will put him before him. I do think the civil action is extremely useful. You don't need any excess happy faces, and he is already a strong leader. Sometimes you are not really able to take him because he costs 3 additional civil actions and you just don't have a way to get unhappy workers, but oftentimes it's maybe nice to just have as many happy faces as you need, and then it more often than not is possible, maybe just with increasing a population, to have an unhappy worker and be able to take him. Sometimes you have a very strong yellow bank and a lot of happy faces, maybe because you had St. Peter's Basilica or something like this, or you had already a lot of happy faces and then out of the sudden you want some yellow token colonies. There are definitely situations where Mandela can be taken even with the 3 additional civil action cost, because if you have a nice yellow bank, he can just give you an extremely big amount of value. But of course, more often than not, you only are taking him if he doesn't come with the 3 additional civil action cost. The next leader that we are having is Pierre, and I do think Pierre is extremely strong. And Pierre is one of those leaders and wonders that I am really taking a look at if he is in the game or not when I'm looking at the leaders and wonders overview early in the game, especially as soon as there are arenas on the row or if there are theologies in the row early in the game and I have to consider, do I want to pick one of those, then I always open the leaders and wonders overview, take a look if Pierre's in the game, and if Pierre's in the game, I do think it's definitely worthwhile to try to get yourself into an arena setup, because you need some happy faces anyway. Temples and arenas both have their advantages and disadvantages. Temples giving a bit of culture production throughout the game, arenas giving a bit of strength, which definitely can be very useful. So without any leader synergizing with them, I do think I value arenas and temples relatively similar. Maybe would more often go for temples because you have the chance to get a free temple, and I do think then temples are the more efficient solution without any synergies being considered. But yeah, if Pierre's in the game and you maybe have 2 bread and circuses which you just need to cover your happy faces, as you probably need to cover your happy faces somehow. Bread and circuses are generally H1 happy face solutions, maybe not being the most efficient, but still being very fine. Maybe you are often will be able to get them relatively cheaply. Those are very cheap to build. And then you have a way to fix the happy faces, you get into H3, and then there's just a leader available who, with having that setup, gives you 4 additional culture with the potential to give him more culture. And on top of that, he just gives you a 1 of 8 culture that you're getting for free. And that 1 of 8 culture sometimes can lead to even more culture. Or if you time it nicely, you can either prevent maybe another player going for an aggression or war, or if they still go for it, then another 8 culture is lost for one of your opponents. So those Olympic Games, just get them for free, and it's free 8 culture on top of a leader that already can produce you some culture. And with that, I think Pierre is extremely strong, and I will put him in S tier because I do think I not that rarely find myself in situations where I'm a bit behind in one of the outs, how I could maybe get back into the game if I have my arena set up, which I'm more often than not having when Pierre's in the game, or at least trying to get. I'm not overpaying for anything, but if I just have the chance to get a bread and circuses at some point, I maybe will try to pick it up. And then Pierre can often be one key element of how you can come back into the game, because he can really very much accelerate the amount of culture that you can produce. But of course, if you have no arenas, he's not really that great. But sometimes you can maybe then start building some arenas with pro sports. Pro sports are generally nice for a lot of impacts, so sometimes that can be already a somewhat decent or nice thing to do. And sometimes you just get him very late. And if you have him, maybe elect him at your second last turn, and then at the last turn get the Olympic Games, you have gotten 8 culture for having him 2 turns, so 4 culture per turn, so even without having any arenas, it can sometimes be worthwhile to be picked up and then just elect it very late. Maybe if you have a strong H2 leader that you want to keep for a long time, and then maybe you have a chance to at some point get pro sports, or even if not, you just get still the 8 culture, which is quite strong. Additionally, Pierre synergizes very nicely with the internet, If you have pro sports with Pierre, each pro sports gives 6 points for the internet, which is, and those are not that expensive to build. And with that, if you have 3 pro sports, the internet is already at 18, have some science production on top, and it is already a very strong wonder. So with Pierre, you can sometimes set up for very nice internet. Yeah, and with at the end, Pierre just ends up in S tier, because I do think he's just extremely strong. One thing to consider, which I will also mention when I now talk about Sid Meier, is that you sometimes don't, you have to be careful to not make the mistake of maximizing the output of your leader compared to maximizing the overall culture output, because it's of course easy to say maybe on a situation where you could go for let's say movie with Chaplain, or you have team spots in hand still and you have the chance to build a few of them relatively quickly with Pierre. Maybe more often than not, Pierre can still be the right leader for you, but you have to be careful to not have a false reasoning, because you should not think, all right, when I build those 3 arenas, Pierre is giving me 6 culture per turn, and Chaplain is only giving me 4 culture per turn, if I would go for the movie, so let's go for Pierre. You of course have to consider that the movie plus Chaplain, as the movie is already producing something by itself, is giving you 8 culture, and then if you have 3 arenas, those will only produce you 6. Of course, you're still getting the Olympic Games, and it's not that easy to set up an example, but I sometimes think I saw some players, or in some discussions, there maybe was sometimes this potentially false argument. You have to consider, of course, how strong the setup is of the leader, plus the things that you want to do when you go for this leader, in evaluating the situations in the arena are not producing any culture by themselves. So especially if you haven't them developed yet, you shouldn't fall into the trap of just thinking, all right, let's build those arenas and then I'm getting more culture out of Pierre than what the other leaders that are available are offering me, while you maybe at the same time, I don't know, could also build an opera and a multimedia with Flaming, and that would just be a lot more culture in total. Most of you probably don't make this mistake, but I have seen it sometimes, so I want to mention it, and that also is relevant for the next leader that I want to talk about, at least in some situations. And the next leader is Sid Meier. And Sid Meier, of course, is also a leader with lots of potential. Even the leader who maybe can produce you the most culture by itself in H3, I think, if I'm not missing out on something. Mandela can go up to 10 potentially, but Sid Meier, if you have 4 computers, is producing you 3 additional culture per computer, so 12 additional culture. And if you have the Acropolis, he potentially can even produce you 15 additional culture, so a lot of additional culture production. And if you are in a setup with having some labs already, he can be quite strong, but he also has some disadvantages. For example, if you get him relatively early, I do think it is not that rarely that losing the science production is definitely a downside, because oftentimes you really want to have a lot of science during age 3. And if you have the ability to go for computers with Sid Meier, I do think that's not that often a problem, because you can just go for 2, maybe 3 computers if you have the resources, and then even with Sid Meier still have a very nice science production, still are nicely prepared for a wonder like spaceflight or some science impacts. But especially if he is very early, you have maybe 2 scientific methods. Of course, you could elect him and get 4 additional culture production, and maybe build a 3rd one and have 6 additional culture production, but the science cost is just can be a bit painful. So I do think that Maya sometimes is a bit better to maybe get a little bit later during age 3. And ideally, of course, if you have computers, and generally I do think, while Bill Gates, for example, works very well also already with scientific methods, I think scientific methods with Sid Meier is somewhat mediocre. It basically turns the scientific method building into a journalism building. And of course, if you have already those labs, that can still be nice. But it's just not that great maybe. And So I think he's mainly good with computers, but sometimes, of course, can also be worthwhile with having the scientific methods. He, of course, synergizes very nicely with the internet, as each computer that you have with him will produce 3 culture and 4 science, so 7 points per computer that you're having for the internet. And that definitely, like Pierre, allows for some big internet builds. At the end, I will put him in C tier behind Chaplain, so the lowest rated leader that so far. It of course depends a lot on how your setup is. If you are very often on a lab setup, then of course Sid Mayer will often be a worthwhile leader. But I just think I rather rarely end up going for him, and if I'm considering early on if I maybe rather want to go for labs or not, he is definitely part of the reasoning, but definitely not as strong of a reasoning as, for example, if there's Bill Gates in the game. And then, of course, something to consider, as I also considered about Pierre, you also shouldn't fall into the trap of considering how much culture you can get out of the leader, but again, evaluate how strong the overall position is. For example, if it's a very theoretical example, and I do think this is why the reason why Sid Meier is worthwhile and can be quite strong is because you have labs, and that's just the situation that we are in. But sometimes you have the possibility to maybe just also set up multimedias. Maybe you have alchemies, and there are computers in the row, and but there's also multimedia on the row. You could of course go for computers with Sid Meier, but you can maybe, if you have the free workers, sometimes you don't have them, then Sid Meier is perfectly fine in such a situation. But sometimes you have a free worker, and maybe there's also Einstein plus multimedia lying around. And each computer with Sid Meier is basically a building that produces 4 science and 3 culture, but it's only slightly better than having a multimedia. And Einstein gives you a big science boost, gives you culture, or for developing text, and a multimedia will give 3 culture by just having the multimedia. So again, you shouldn't fall trap into considering how much you can get out of the leader, but rather evaluating how strong the setup is that you are going into if you now want to go for that leader compared to maybe some other options that are available. Sometimes you have the ability to go for multimedia and Fleming, and then maybe have movie operas in hand, and then that just produces you a lot more culture than just going all in into computer upgrades, which sometimes still can be the right decision. It might prepare you nicely for impacts and might allow you to go for a big space flight or Manhattan Project, but you have to be careful with that. And with that, if some players will maybe now say Sid Meier can give you 9 culture production per turn, that's a lot more than what the other leaders can give you. That's on one hand true, but on the other hand, just having the labs do not produce any culture by themselves. And if you have the opportunity to go for different culture setup, then those different culture setups have the advantages that the buildings itself already produce some culture. But of course, the reality is that you have those labs sometimes lying around. Investing into computers is nice anyway, and then Sid Meier can be a perfectly fine leader, but I don't find myself going for him that often. So I, at the end, put him in C tier. The next leader that we are having is Steve Jobs, a leader that can potentially be quite powerful, but at the end I also will put in C tier, I think between Chaplain and Sid Meier. Of course, the one leader that you maybe should compare Steve Jobs to is Einstein, because both of them give you culture when you develop a technology. Einstein 3 culture, Steve Jobs 4 culture, but you have to pay a resource for it. And let's just say those abilities are somewhat similar. Sometimes you have a lot of resource lying around, and of course Steve Jobs is better, but I do think there are definitely also situations where you are in a situation I can build this wonder, and then I have only very few resources left, and I actually can't activate Steve Jobs as often as I would like to. So let's just say those are relatively similarly strong abilities to convert developing technologies into culture. And then both of them have one ability left. Steve Jobs can give you up to 3 happy faces, while Einstein can just give you some science production. And again, it's basically the same like when I talked about Chaplain. If you're actually needing those happy faces and also can make use out of the science developing ability of Steve Jobs, I do think Steve Jobs can be a very, very fine leader. But if you're not needing the happy faces, then Einstein just gives you some useful science production, especially if you get him early, that can be quite useful, and then will also translate into getting more culture actually out of his ability, while Steve Jobs doesn't produce any culture by itself, which then can be converted into culture by developing technologies with his ability. So especially early, I do think Albert Einstein is often a better leader, while Steve Jobs maybe gets later in the game better. Maybe you can at some point make it that you then will need the happy faces, and then you maybe don't need the science production as much any longer. And especially if you're noticing that you have some overflow resource anyway, then just developing some technologies and getting quite a bunch of culture out of it is quite strong. And similar to Einstein, maybe even more, Steve Jobs can also be a very nice leader to get late in the age. Maybe you again have just saved up some science, have 3 texts in hand, and you maybe had a culture leader like Bach and produced a lot of culture with him. Then for the last turn, you're just electing Steve Jobs and develop those 3 technologies, got 12 culture in one turn, which is very, very strong. And so definitely a very nice use case. So Steve Jobs can be a perfectly fine leader, but you have to pay resources, you have to pay actions to develop those technologies. Some, of course, as I said for Einstein, you probably want to develop a bunch of techs anyway, but sometimes, of course, with Steve Jobs and Einstein, you want to develop even more techs just for the sake of developing technologies, and that needs some actions. So if you're not needing the happy faces, Steve Jobs is maybe not that great, but if you're actually making use out of the happy faces, then he can definitely be quite powerful, or maybe as a transitional lead, or you just have that many resources in science that you, even with not needing the happy faces, just can generate a lot of culture with him. So no. For all of the leaders and wonders, all of them can be very strong, but Steve Jobs I also maybe don't end up going for as often. So I will put him in C tier. And now the last leader that we are having, maybe his rating will definitely be a bit influenced on myself noticing how how rarely I actually go for him, because he's the only leader that I had less often than Bill Gates in the last 2 world championships that I played. In the first one I actually Churchill 0 times, in the second one I had Churchill 1 time. Which is maybe a bit weird, because Churchill is a leader that you can just take, elect, and you are just getting some 3 additional culture every turn without needing any setup, which the first definitely looks quite nice. And then you have the ability to get some additional science and resources for the military, which of course can be quite useful. The opponents always have to calculate in that you could activate Churchill, so it's basically like having a copy of reserves in hand if you have him in play, because you always have some more military resources available that you can use to threaten more strength. So all of that sounds very reasonable. You don't need any setup, so why do I end up going for him that rarely, and why do I now at the end rate him relatively low, while maybe it could just be fair to at least maybe put him in B tier, because he doesn't require any setup and is giving you something nice. No. I think if you go for Churchill and just get 3 culture per turn, I do think that is just very mediocre, because if we take a look at all of the other H3 leaders, most of them are giving something like 3 culture, but all of them are giving something on top. And of course, Churchill is also giving something on top with the military ability. I just first of all want to say that if you just get Churchill for the bit of additional culture, it can be fine, especially I think if an early iconoclasm was revealed, or if you're having Robespierre and you just need to get a leader as quickly as possible, then getting Churchill early is just a lot better than maybe getting someone else later on. But if you are just having 3 culture per turn, I do think that's mediocre, especially because it doesn't come in the form of culture production, meaning it doesn't count for impact of culture, it doesn't count for impact of balance, it doesn't synergize with any of the wonders like Hollywood and internet, for example Chaplain, Molina Ditri, Fleming. A lot of those leaders will give a boost to one of those wonders, while Churchill's culture is not. And if you're using him just for 3 additional resources, sometimes for the military, of course, in some situations that can be extremely helpful, either to help yourself setting up a big military push or maybe defending yourself against one. So that, of course, can be fine. I do think the best way to use Churchill maybe is if you are maybe trying to set up a military push, or maybe you have to defend against one, and maybe you don't have that many military technologies developed yet. sometimes there is the possibility to maybe get multiple turns in a row, or in total 3 signs and 3 resources out of Churchill. Sometimes that will be possible, and then of course getting 3 signs and 3 resources during one turn can definitely be quite useful, and in a situation where you don't need to build military, at least you're getting 3 culture. But that I think is one very nice use case of Churchill, just getting that big amount of value out of him with being able to develop text cheaper and getting the additional resource for building some military units. I do think that is potentially quite strong, but if you're going for that and want to get a lot of value out of him like this, you're also committing a little bit into a direction, because then again, if you maybe switch plans and you're just getting 3 culture out of him, that again is then not quite mediocre, I would say. So that's maybe a little bit problematic. Of course, one nice thing to note about Churchill is that his military resource and science, you can already make use out of them while not even having elected him. Sometimes you have a strong H2 leader, again maybe for example Bach, you have Churchill in hand, and when the other players have to consider if they want to go for war, they always have to consider Churchill even though you didn't even elect him yet, which is nice. Something that not a lot of leaders can do. I mean, some others maybe can. Marie Curie can give you some strengths, but I think for Churchill that can be quite a nice effect. Nonetheless, I go for him very rarely. I think it is worth it for the H3 leaders to put some work into having a nice setup for them to then get a lot out of them, compared to just going for a leader that doesn't really require any setup and then just gives you something fine or mediocre. I do think you want to go for a nice setup and get something nice out of the H3 leader, and maybe because of that I end up going for Churchill very rarely, maybe also because I often tend to have strong economies and with that don't really need his help to defend myself. And so for myself, I will put him in C tier, and maybe even at the bottom of the list. I think I will put him at the bottom. Sid Mayer just has also just a very big potential, synergizes with the Wonder. But if you in your list maybe put him in B tier, that's also perfectly fine, because he is just a leader that will always give you something that is also worth something on its own. But I, as said, go for him extremely rarely for some reason. I didn't really notice it until I just counted my World Championship games, and with that I will put him at the bottom of C tier. Maybe it's too harsh, but I do think a lot of the leaders, if you put a little bit of work into your setup, can just give you more. But as said, Churchill also can give you a lot, especially if you are low on resources, and then if you get the resource for the military and maybe also the science sometimes, that can give you a lot of additional value and makes it a lot easier to set up a lot of military. Then we are now finished with the leaders. As you can see, I put no leader in D tier, and that's just because I couldn't justify it for any one of those, because all of them can just be really great in the right circumstance. So I think it's fine to put none of those leaders in D tier. So now we are going to rate those wonders that are left for H3. And we are starting with the Empire State Building, who has a one-step wonder with one step that costs 17 resources, which is definitely quite a bit unique. And I do think it's not that easily possible to pull off a very strong Empire State Building, because that would mean that you are in a lot of areas just better than all of your opponents. And if we consider now 3-player games, that's just not that easily possible to achieve, especially because ties are not enough. You need to actually be better than your opponents in order to get the points for each category. And then, of course, sometimes the Empire State Building can be a win more wonder, because if you are better in all of those areas, chances are that you maybe have a nice position already anyway, and then maybe it's a win more wonder. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, because it's not that rarely that maybe one player has a greedy culture setup and the other player has a strong economy setup, and then maybe late in H3 the strong economy player has overtaken the greedy culture player in a lot of areas, maybe even all areas, and then the Empire State Building can be a very nice and efficient way of getting a lot of culture going. But if that specific situation isn't there, then getting a lot of culture out of the Empire State Building is quite difficult. Maybe you have fulfilling in 3-player games 2 or 3 categories can still be fine. You are getting a 16 or 24 culture wonder, so that's perfectly fine and it is achievable. But for wonders like, for example, fast food chains, you can just take them relatively early. Maybe you have a turn where you have some free civil actions and then you know relatively exactly how much culture you will get out of them. While if you take the Empire State Building, the other players are very motivated to make that wonder low scoring wonder for you, and sometimes will do some actions partly or even just because of the reason of maybe stealing some points from the Empire State Building from you, and so it always feels a bit tricky to commit to this one early unless you are having a really strong economy going. The Empire State Building only requires 1 civil action, which is, I think, mainly advantage, of course. Sometimes it can be bad. You can't that easily use something like Engineering Genius 2, which you sometimes have lying around in your hand. It's a lot easier to use in the fast food chains. And also sometimes you have maybe a weird bronze mine setup, maybe with a big Suez canal, and then actually sometimes it can happen that you don't have enough blue tokens to accumulate enough resources on the bronze mines to build this. It's rather a rare case, but it can sometimes happen. But I do think it can be definitely an advantage that it only costs 1 stage and 1 civil action to build, because sometimes you maybe didn't had a chance to grab one of the wonders early, with the plan, of course, most of the times being to finish it at the last turn, and you don't have a wonder lying around, and then for the last turn you have to take and finish a wonder in 1 turn, and it of course can be a lot easier with the Empire State Building than with one of the other wonders. That being said, I do think I not that rarely end up with a technology like architecture, engineering, or maybe masonry, and that advantage of the Empire State Building is definitely quite a bit less big than if those technologies wouldn't exist. So I think it's not that big of an advantage, but it definitely can be. At the end, I will put the Empire State Building in C tier, because I think it's not that easy to make it very big. Sometimes it's not even easy to make it somewhat reasonably strong, and there's always the danger that your opponents are trying to make your life a little bit miserable with trying to take some categories away from you, or making it costly for you to fulfill those categories, and with that it will end up being in C tier. That being said, I had it a fairly big amount and fairly often actually in my World Championship games, or maybe more often than that, you sometimes just find a way to build it, but I don't remember myself very often going for a very big Empire State Building, so that I just don't pull off that often, and then if you just get 16 or 24 points out of it, I mean 24 is perfectly fine, but 16 is really not that strong, so at the end I will put it in C tier. Next we have the fast food chains, and the fast food chains is a wonder that is maybe the most consistent, because it almost all of the times gives you a very reasonable amount of points, but it also very rarely gives you a very big amount of points. Mostly those points will maybe be in between a little bit less than 20, let's say 16 or 17, until something like 25 or 26. Most of the times you will be in that range. Of course, sometimes you can maybe go almost up to 30. Definitely have maybe also 1 or 2 times seen fast food chains being bigger than 30, but I do think that's very rarely, and it's also very rarely worse than something like 16 points. So I think it's just a very consistent wonder that you can just take, and you know that you have something decent to invest into in your last turn when you can just spend all of your resources. And most of the times it will maybe give you something around 20 points, and that is just very fine. It's a very fine amount of culture to get. You don't really need a big setup or something, and with that I will end up putting it in B tier, because I do think it sometimes can be worthwhile to try setting up for wonder that can score you a lot points. I did consider putting it at A tier just because it's that consistent, and the other wonders, most of them are just not. But it also has a very limited ceiling, I would say, and with that I will put it in B tier, and I do think that's probably a fine placement. Next up we have the Hollywood, which is in 2-player games probably S tier plus, because there are so often it's just a culture race going on, and then both players are prepared to go for 40 plus culture Hollywood, and then whoever gets it has a big advantage. Of course, two-player games are more nuanced than that, but it's definitely some truth to it, and there are definitely not that rarely situations that are, at least to some extent, like what I just told. So definitely S tier plus in two-player games, but how is it for three and four-player games? Because it's definitely not that easily possible to make very big investments into culture-producing buildings like theaters and libraries in three and four-player games. But I do think it still can be possible to create a decent Hollywood and also always the potential to build a strong Hollywood, especially with those synergizing leaders, Chaplain, Fleming, Marlene Dietrich. If you go for one of those, it's definitely possible to make the Hollywood quite big without a very big investment. If you have Chaplain with only one movie, the Hollywood is already at 16 points, which is not great, but if you just get one more movie, it's already at 24 points, which is already quite strong, I would say. With Fleming, you can just go for one big opera or movie, one multimedia or journalism, and Hollywood will already be quite strong. So I do think it's possible to make it somewhat decent, and it just has a very high ceiling. Of course, you don't get those big culture producing games that often, as often as in two-player games, definitely a lot more rarely, but those are still there, and Hollywood still has the potential to be extremely strong, and sometimes it's just one part of a big plan to catch up maybe in H3. You have a very strong economy, the other players have quite a big lead. Of course, you could try to go for the military, but if you don't have the necessary pieces for that yet, it's always a big risk. But maybe you have a chance to grab Fleming, maybe with multimedia, you have already one opera set up, and then you can go for the Hollywood and maybe not invest too much into those buildings while there is still the threat of wars and such things, unless your economy can support it. But you can maybe sometimes accumulate some resources, then build a bunch of those buildings in the last two turns and finish a very big Hollywood. So a 40 plus culture Hollywood is definitely a lot more rarely than in two-player games, but I do think it's still achievable, and it can be a nice part of a plan of catching up. With that, I will put the Hollywood in A tier. Could be considered to move it down to B tier for three and four player games, but I do think it's still a very powerful wonder that you has lots of potential and that you at least sometimes can just make decently strong without too much effort, especially if you are having the right leader available. And I do think with having the Hollywood, it is definitely not bad to go for one of those leaders. So it's not like you have to do something just to make this wonder work. I do think it's quite strong and it really intensifies, makes it that you should maybe go for one of those leaders, especially if then the game isn't that military heavy and you actually can score a lot of points. If you just have this wonder laying around, the other players always know if the game remains peaceful, you have a big advantage. Maybe they then will push for the military, but maybe they will push for the military in a situation where they actually don't really want to. So yeah, I will at the end up putting Hollywood in A tier for three-player games and four-player games. Maybe it's even a bit more difficult to make it work. Maybe I would move it down to B tier. But for three-player games, I will leave it in A tier because those culture-producing strategies sometimes can just also work quite well in three-player games. Next up, we have a wonder that is maybe somewhat similar to the Hollywood, the internet. You also need a lot of urban buildings to make that one work. There are also some leaders that synergize with that, mainly maybe Sid Mayer and Pierre for the internet, maybe also Bill Gates, just because you can build a lot of stuff and having a bunch of computers also already scores quite a bunch of points for the internet. And yeah, and of course also Fleming, Marlene, Chaplain, Einstein, a lot of leaders synergize. Also even Marie Curie with giving a strength bonus to your best lab will synergize with the internet and give some additional points to that. I still think that the internet is not as strong as the Hollywood because I do think it's more difficult to get an as strong internet as it is to get a very strong Hollywood. And also I think it's more difficult to make it decent. I mean, I think more often than not, the internet will always at least score you some points, maybe something like 10, 12. But it's more difficult to put it into a worthwhile amount, I think. But it still can be a wonder that also can help you catching up. You can make it quite big. you can get a lot of culture out of it. So I do think it's also a wonder that definitely you have to keep an eye on when it is in the game, as a way of maybe just getting a lot of culture going in H3. Nonetheless, I think I will end up putting it one tier below the Hollywood. The question is behind the fast food chains. I think I will put it behind the fast food chains. The internet has the higher ceiling, but the fast food chains is just so incredibly consistent. I think you will end up having the fast food chains more often than the internet because of that consistency. But of course, the number of times you take it is not the main reason on how I do those rankings. Otherwise, Bill Gates, at least for me, would be in D tier. But still, I don't see big internets that often as I see big Hollywoods. But it's definitely something you should have in mind, because it can be quite strong, and you should build towards if you have the nice opportunity to for it, especially if you have a leader like Pierre or Sid Mayer. The next wonder is a very special one. It's the Red Cross, the only wonder that can be built by food, and the only wonder where the opponents can help you with building it and get some benefits on their own out of it. And it's of course not that it's not that easy to rate the Red Cross compared to the other wonders. It's definitely a very important thing that you need to look at the Leaders and Wonders overview, because that really makes it stronger to have a lot of food production and to maybe have the ability to have some food lying around. It also makes architecture, engineering or masonry technologies more valuable, because the ideal scenario is, of course, if you have actually 15 food lying around or more, you can take the Red Cross and you can finish it. But that is not that easy to achieve, because first of all you need to have a lot of food lying around. That often will lead to some corruption issues. Sometimes you need the food to get more workers out, as you might need them maybe for the military or some other places. And also taking and finishing the Red Cross just produces or just takes a lot of civil actions, and that is not that easily possible to achieve. However, if you achieve it, then you are getting 30 points, and then even more depending on how many colonies are in play. Maybe 4 or 5 colonies is maybe a little bit the average. I didn't count something or like this, but that's maybe what I would be guessing. So then it do something like a 35 points wonders. That is very strong, and it is a wonder that you can just build just by food, meaning even if you are somewhat ending up in bronze mines in H3, it's a wonder that you can maybe get a lot of points out. And it also means that it oftentimes is maybe the most easiest way to actually go for 2 H3 wonders. You can go for the Red Cross, build that wonder with food, and you maybe still then have afterwards enough resources left to go for another wonder. While going for 2 resource cost wonders is definitely also possible in the right setup, but maybe not that easily possible. If you don't manage to build a Red Cross in one go, then it of course completely depends on how the situation of the opponents is looking and how many steps you maybe can at least build during one go. For example, if you can take the Red Cross and build 4 steps immediately, that of course can also still be quite strong. But if you maybe just take the Red Cross, don't build any step, and then all of the opponents will build 1 step in 3-player games, both of them are getting 6 culture out of it, you then get 18 culture out of it, so you gained plus 12 culture, plus of course the amount of colonies against those 2 opponents, which is compared to the other wonders not that big of an amount. Nonetheless, it can still be very fine to go for something like this, especially if you have some excess food. It's still some points that you are getting, and you can go for that, and maybe, as said, one of the other wonders. So you have to really consider in such situations if it is really worth it, because the food can maybe also be nicely used for more population. But even though if you just calculate how much culture you are getting against those opponents, it's not that great, but it's still some culture. It only costs some food that sometimes can be affordable, and it allows you to then maybe still afterwards go for another H3 wonder. So in 4-player games, if you are not building any step, then even up to 3 opponents might build a step, and you might only get 2 in such a case. Of course, you're only getting 6 points against each opponent. That is really not that great, so you have to be careful, especially in 4-player games, and really have to think about, is it really worthwhile to go for this Red Cross, especially because you are the one investing the civil actions to take it. So that's definitely something to consider in 2-player games. There's only one other player who can build a step, so that's maybe the most easiest possible to get a very decent amount of culture out of it. Even though still, if you are building 4 steps, the opponent's 1, you are getting plus 18 against that one opponent that you're having, plus the amount of colonies. It's still not completely great, but because you can just build it with food, can then still definitely be quite decent. And of course, you have to take a look at your opponent's civilization. Maybe some of them don't have food lying around and can't actually build a step. Maybe they could build a step, but it would prevent them from increasing their population, meaning they have to decide. Either they maybe can get a pop out and do some stuff with it that they would like to do, or they don't do this and build a step. So it's really worthwhile to take a close look at your opponents on how easily they can actually afford the food. And now, so quite an influential wonder on how much you maybe should take a look at it when in the Leaders and Wonders overview, as it really can depend on the red cross existence in the game on how much food production you want to set up. And I at the end will put it in B tier. It's very difficult to rate. I think I will actually put it at the top end of B tier. It is a wonder that has a lot of potential. It is a wonder where you can easily build it and another wonder because it's paid in food. But it can also be mediocre only if you just get 2 or 3 steps out of it. Of course, in a 3-player game, that's a 3-player list. You hopefully most of the times will at least get 3 steps out of it, as only 2 steps can build by your opponents in one round. But that's then already not that great any longer, but because you can build it with food, it sometimes can still be completely worthwhile. And if you manage to just take it, build it with having a lot of civil actions, maybe architecture or something, then it can just be extremely strong and really give you a big boost for the game. And so I think I will put it at the top end of B tier, but it's very difficult to rate this compared to the other wonders. The next wonder that we are having is the Manhattan Project, who gives you 13 additional strength for 14 resources and also gives you an amount of culture depending on your science production. And now, the Manhattan Project, I think you, if you want to have a strong or good or decent Manhattan Project, most of the times you need to make use out of both of the abilities. Building the Manhattan Project just for the strength sometimes can be worthwhile, especially if you are low on population, if you're maybe low on science and can't invest into that many military techs. The Manhattan Project and the 13 additional strength that you can get out of it can be extremely strong. But in situations where you have a good tactic, where you have enough population to put into military units, it most of the times will be more efficient to actually build those units compared to the investment that you are getting out of it and the strength potential that you can maybe reach compared to just building the Manhattan Project for the strength. And it's also quite rarely that you have that much science production that the Manhattan Project is worthwhile just building for the culture, but it happens. I definitely have seen Manhattan projects with plus 20 plus culture, and then it's a very, very solid amount of culture, obviously. Ideally, you make use out of both. You maybe can just somehow use the strength very nicely, maybe just maybe you can just take and finish the Manhattan Project, get the strength now, and then compared to maybe having to commit population into the military, you can keep those population free, and depending on how the situation develops, you can also put them into urban buildings. And then if you have already some decent science production, you're getting a bit of a small culture push. You are just having those 13 additional strength without requiring any population, which is definitely not bad. And then I think the Manhattan Project is quite strong. So now, ideally, you just have some science production and can make some use out of the strength. But as said, be careful it's not in every situation where you need strength, the Manhattan Project will be the efficient way to do it. Especially if you have an H3 tactic and enough population, it's really most of the times it will be better to go for those units in order to achieve the amount of strength than to go for building the Manhattan Project. One advantage, of course, of the Manhattan Project is that it gives you a big amount of strength without requiring any military actions. So sometimes you can build it while being on 3 military actions and get a bunch of strength going while still getting 3 draws. Draws can be very important in H3, so that can be quite worthwhile. And sometimes you can declare war and wouldn't have that much strength, can't build that much strength from your military actions that you're having left, but you can finish the Manhattan Project and give your strength a nice boost youth with that. At the end, I will put the Manhattan Project in B tier. I think at the lower end of B tier, because I think I don't go for it that often. But there are definitely situations where it's very useful. Either you just need a way to get a lot of strength and don't have a nice alternative way available, or it just saves you some workers and maybe you have a decent amount of science production, or sometimes you can have a leader like Bill Gates build a lot of computers, or maybe Einstein have a lot of science production and actually get quite a decent amount of culture out of it, and also get the strength, which can be nice for impact of strength, or if you finish it before the last round while already having a lot of science production. Of course, the strength might also help you for strength events and so on, and then it at the same time produces you maybe an amount of culture that is already at least worthwhile for an H3 wonder. So yeah, it's also not that easily to rate it compared to those other wonders. So no, but at the end I will put it at the lower end of B tier. The next wonder that we are having is the spaceflight. And I do think the spaceflight is quite a strong wonder, because it is maybe similar to fast food chains, that most of the times it will at least score you something like 16 or 17 points if you didn't neglect science production completely during the game. So it has a relatively high floor on what the minimum amount is that it will achieve. But compared to the fast food chains, I do think it's also easier, or it's definitely a lot more easily possible to make a very high scoring wonder out of the spaceflight if you go into a specific direction with your game plan. If you go for big economy, big science production, maybe a leader like Einstein, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and then go for a lot of technologies, the spaceflight can definitely easily score you 30 plus culture if you went for a strong science game. So it is a wonder that has a high potential, maybe not as high as wonders like Hollywood or potentially internet can have, but still a relatively high potential. Getting more than 30 culture out of a wonder is very, very strong. But it also has a relatively high floor. It's normally, I think, often it's similarly strong to fast food chains at least, but then sometimes it's just stronger and has the potential to be even really strong. And with that, I myself end up very often with the space flight, and I will put it actually in S tier. And ceiling isn't as high as of the Hollywood, but it almost all of the time gives you a decent amount of points, meaning you can just take it without really knowing exactly how the game will be continuing. For other wonders, if you grab them early, you are making a bit of a commitment. If you take Hollywood and internet early, and then the game is very military heavy, out of the sudden those wonders are not really giving you anything. For the Empire State Building, it's often difficult to see how much categories you will be able to win. So you can just take the space flight, you don't make a big commitment, but you have the potential of having a high scoring wonder, and you at least have a decent wonder lying around. And with that, I will put it in S tier, just because it's so consistent, and it's still a wonder that has a very potentially high culture output. So I think for 3 and 4 player games, Spaceflight is maybe with that the best H3 wonder. Because of its consistency in 2 player games, I think it definitely goes maybe 1 or even 2 tiers down, maybe only 1, but maybe even 2, because sometimes it's just not big enough. And also sometimes with going for more culture production early, it's on average less strong than it maybe would be in 3 and 4 player games. So in 2 player games, not as strong, but can still of course be very, very decent. But especially for 3 and 4 player games, I think it's just a very, very pleasant wonder to have, that you can take without too much of a commitment, and that you can still make quite strong. The last wonder that we are having is the United Nations. And the United Nations is maybe again a relatively wonder that most of the times will at least give you a somewhat solid amount, but maybe not as solid as the floor of fast food chains and spaceflight is, because sometimes you maybe have not that many wonders, not that many blue techs, not that many urban buildings. So it definitely happens that a UN will only by itself give you 12 culture, and that you maybe don't have an impact to evaluate. Sometimes you have an impact, but you rather want to push it to get a 3 culture for seeding, then you don't have 1 left for the United Nations to evaluate. So it doesn't give you as consistently as the fast food chains and spaceflight nice amount of points. And then the ceiling of it is also not that high. I do think that's a lot more easily possible to get a lot of culture out of the spaceflight than out of the United Nations. I think the United Nations can definitely end up being A big United Nations, I think, is probably better than a big fast food chains. Big fast food chains maybe like 26 or 27 points. Then you can really say, oh, that's a big fast food chains. For you to United Nations, sometimes you get 16 or 20 culture out of just by building it. Maybe you have all of the urban building types. Maybe you build a lot of wonders in the early game. Then you can maybe get something like 20. And if you then have an impact to evaluate, you can definitely go up to 30 or something with it. But I do think it's not that easily possible to really get a big amount of points out of it. So I will at the end put it in C tier, but it's only requires 2 steps to build. With that, it's relatively cheap to build from the civil action cost, and it's at least most of the times gives you a bit of points, so you can just take it and know that you have a wonder lying around, which will give you some points. And of course, sometimes you can do some fun stuff with it, maybe finishing it before your last turn, and you have a very strong impact, maybe impact of tech, maybe impact of colonies, just one impact where you have a really big benefit over your opponents, and then you can evaluate it one time with the United Nations and still seed it into the deck, which can be quite strong. That of course means that you have to finish your wonder before your last turn, which sometimes is something that you can't really do because it requires a lot of resources to invest in at a time when maybe you still are at risk of getting hit by a war or maybe an aggression. And with all of that, I will put it in C tier. And as you can see also for the wonders, I didn't dare to put any wonder in D tier because all of them can just be very, very strong in the right situation. So generally this H3 tier list is very limited in its usefulness. Because as I said at the beginning, it just depends a lot on your setup, but maybe there are some leaders and wonders that have a higher ceiling, that are maybe more consistent in what they are doing, and so I tried and set up this tier list, which is of course heavily influenced on my personal playstyle. Alright, with that we have this tier list finished. I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about it. Are there leaders and wonders that you personally go a lot more often for, that you value a lot more highly or less highly than I do? Are there some things about the list that you don't agree with at all? Definitely let me know in the comments. I'm very interested to hear your opinion. And then I hope it was a nice video for you. I hope you enjoyed this little tier list series as a little bit of something different than what you usually see on this channel. But next up we again will see some analysis videos from the World Championship and maybe also from one other tournament. But I won't say anything more about that yet. And with that, thanks for watching. Have a nice time and see you in the next video.